So I am talking this afternoon about a book I published in September called "'Cause." The title at the time was The Life and Times of Michael A., the subtitle, that is, and now the new subtitle is An American Tragedy. Michael A. stands for Michael Allen. Michael was my baby cousin. Let me tell you first a little bit about myself, and then I'll tell you more about Michael and why I've written this book, which is a memoir, a personal story. It's a story about mass incarceration. We often hear the figure that 2.3 or so million Americans are currently incarcerated. We forget that each of those people is connected to, you pick a number, 4 other people, 6 other people. So millions of Americans are right this moment directly affected by the experience of incarceration. But how many of those stories have you actually heard? There are millions of stories that we might hear. We don't hear them. Who am I? As Eliot said, I'm a professor at Harvard. I'm a political philosopher. I spent my career thinking about democracy, what makes healthy democracies. And about, 10 years ago or so, Professor Henry Louis Gates Jr., Skip Gates, invited me to give a series of lectures at Harvard. This was before I was a faculty member at Harvard. You might know Professor Gates as the producer of Roots and the television series about tracing your own genetic lineage and things like that. Skip is a remarkable intellectual. When you are invited by Skip to do something, you say yes. And so I said, yes, I'll give this series of 3 lectures, the Dubois Lectures. The purpose of the Dubois Lectures is to say something about the state of affairs for African Americans in the contemporary United States. W.E.B. Du Bois, of course, was a great sociologist from the late 19th and early 20th century. The series is named after him. And his powerful book, The Souls of Black Folk, is an inspiration for what you're supposed to do with the lectures. I had to say yes. I said yes. And then every time the date got close, I would cancel, reschedule. Along the way, too, I would give Skip titles that were very abstract, titles like Political Equality and Justice in the 21st Century, or African Americans and Opportunity in the 21st Century. And then the date would come close, and I would cancel again. And finally, Skip said, OK, look, kid, you're going to have to give these lectures. And I realized that the reason I was consistently canceling was because I couldn't possibly pretend to comment on the state of affairs for African Americans in this country without telling my cousin's story. I grew up with my cousin in the 70s in Los Angeles. I'm from a big extended family. My dad had 11 brothers and sisters. They grew up in northern Florida, an island off the coast of Florida. A whole bunch of them moved to California in the 60s in pursuit of opportunity. It's a story that you're all familiar with. And that group of siblings had any number of kids running around, but within that big extended family, my father was very close to his baby sister, Karen. And so my brother and I were very close to Karen's 3 kids, Nicholas, Rosalind, Michael. We were like 5 porch steps, I always say, 18 months apart, one after the next. I was the oldest, so I was the bossy one, the one in charge, the shepherd for this group. And we grew up in Southern California, lots of beautiful time playing outside in gorgeous weather like this, climbing trees, playing football in the street in front of our house, going back and forth for family gatherings and that sort of thing. When Michael was 15, when I was a graduate student, I was 8 years older than him, I was a graduate student in Cambridge, he was arrested on his first arrest for an attempted carjacking in South Central Los Angeles, where he and his mother then lived. The good news about that attempted carjacking, it's a terrible thing ever to stand in front of a group of people and say that somebody you love did something like that. The good news about it was that the only person who got hurt was Michael, in the sense that his victim wrestled away the gun and shot him through the neck. In the ambulance on the way to the hospital, he confessed to the police officers accompanying him in the ambulance that in addition to that attempted carjacking, which failed, didn't complete it, he had robbed 3 people the previous week in the same block. This was an incredible shock to all of us. There had been nothing like this in his own prior history. As I said, this was 1995 in Southern California, and so think back to that moment. It was a little bit after the National Crime Bill had passed. It was 18 months after California had passed the first 3 strikes you're out law in the nation. It was just months after California had reduced the age at which people could be prosecuted as adults, juveniles could be prosecuted as adults, to 14. And I bet a lot of you don't know that you can catch all of your felonies for a 3 strikes situation in one incident. So Michael got 2 felonies for the attempted carjacking because he had also asked for the gentleman's watch and wallet. So that was 2 felonies there. And then the things he confessed generated 2 more felony charges. They netted him $22, those robberies. So the judge told him that if he went to trial and was convicted on the things he'd in fact confessed to, he would receive a sentence of 25 years to life. So as you might imagine, I shouldn't say as you might imagine. In fact, he accepted a plea bargain, but it was actually a very hard decision. He wasn't able to decide whether to go to trial. He asked his mother to decide. So she stepped outside the courtroom and prayed and accepted it. Sentenced to 12 years, 8 months. The judge who sentenced him wrote a letter. Wrote a letter to the Department of Corrections to say that Michael should be kept in juvenile as long as possible, which at California at the time was up till age 25. But when he was 17, he was transferred to adult facilities and sent to one on the Oregon state border, basically, as far away from Los Angeles as possible. So he spent his first 6 months in adult prison without a family visit. I'm sorry. I wrote this book and I thought it would get better to talk about it, but it gets worse. I apologize. At any rate, so I spent a lot of time on the phone talking to Michael, helped him with distance learning college courses. When he got out in 2006, I was the cousin on duty, as they say, try to help. Housing, job, school. I was dean of the humanities division at the University of Chicago at the time. And so I was telecommuting to my job in Chicago in order to spend the summer with Michael, helping him get situated. We got situated. It's something of a miracle. He had, within 6 weeks, a job, school enrollment, and a place to live. But nonetheless, 3 years later, he was dead, shot by the lover, transgender lover he'd met in prison. So it's one story. I said, Skip, Professor Gates, asked me to give these lectures, and I thought I had to finally try to understand the story. Michael died in 2009, and my family shut down. We did not talk about it at all, to my great embarrassment. And why not? So many reasons, but one of them is shame. These are hard things to talk about. The reason we don't hear these stories is because of shame. We have to figure out how to break through that shame and share these stories. Because the impact of mass incarceration has decimated the African American community in this country. There are so many different examples to give of that, but just one. When I was in Chicago, again, teaching at the University of Chicago, working there, my first husband and I fostered a young man who was essentially homeless, helped him get through the end of his high school years and into college, young African-American man, and he went to a historically black college in Louisiana. The male to female ratio at this school, anybody want to guess? Or female to male, I should put it, 12-1. All right? Boy can't study in a place like that. Good news is he transferred to Ohio State, and so he was able to continue his studies. But the point is that number should really drive home the situation we find ourselves in with respect to the experience of young men of color in this country. So I gave these lectures at Harvard. I think they were the strangest lectures Harvard has ever seen, because I wept consistently through all three of them. And a part of the lectures was about coming to understand how deep the magnitude of this problem is. I knew the facts and figures, I knew the statistics, but after the lectures, I was stunned by the number of people of all races who came up to me and said, I have a family member in prison and I've never told anyone. And I had never told anybody. The whole time I was at the University of Chicago helping my cousin, I told my boss, the provost. I didn't tell anybody else, all right? I was covering the whole time. So this is also a coming out story, okay? So I, as it happens, said I am a political philosopher. The first book I ever wrote was on punishment in ancient Athens. Now, why did I do that? I grew up in Southern California in the 80s, as I've said. I went to Princeton as an undergraduate. And there, as a matter of chance, I took a course with an astonishing classical historian, Josh Obrey. He's at Stanford now, best teacher I've ever had. And we read page after page of Athenian court materials, law speeches, et cetera, judgments, decisions. And one day, my sophomore year in college, I put up my hand and I said, they never say anything about prison. Didn't these people use imprisonment? And Josh said, that's a great question. It would make a terrific dissertation topic. So that's what I went and did. But the result of that, there are a few important points there. I was a kid from Southern California. I had registered the single most important fact in my social environment. Prisons were growing at an extraordinary rate. And I took that question with me to college, and I saw a world where something looked different, and I asked a question about it, and that led me into a journey of thinking about punishment in antiquity. But the result of that journey, too, is I can sit here now and tell you, for a fact, that the world has never seen a penal system like the one we have built. All right? America is a special place. We deserve credit for a whole lot of special inventions, but we have to put this one on our ledger too. Sometimes I tell people the story of my cousin, and I don't get all the way to the end. I just tell the story about, okay, this kid was arrested at 15, it was his first arrest. It was a part of an outbreak of really bad violence, a week's worth of bad violence. That's true, but it was his first arrest. He loved school, he was in school, he wanted to go to college, lots of positive indicators in his life as well. What should his punishment be? I ask people. I say, how should a kid like that be punished? And I ask people to close their eyes and try to think of an answer to that question that doesn't involve prison. And in my experience, most Americans draw a blank. They don't have a way to answer that question. And yet, if you look at other countries, consider this. In our criminal justice system, 70% of the sanctions that we apply are incarceration. Anybody know what that number is in, say, Germany? I guess? 6%. Netherlands, 10%. It is actually possible to build a system that responds to wrongdoing, that thinks about making the victim whole, thinks about the well-being of the community, and thinks about the well-being of the wrongdoer, about helping that wrongdoer become a productive contributor to society. And we can talk more about that in question and answer session. But the point I want to make is just that we Americans have built something distinctive It is not the only way to build a penal system. And I'm not even talking about anything utopian. I'm talking about a place you can buy a plane ticket to understand an alternative. Okay? So my background as a historian and philosopher has permitted me to think about my cousin's story in a bigger picture context. And so there's one other piece to put on the table there about that big picture context. And this is going to sound a little crazy, but the other thing that's helped me understand my cousin's story is the Declaration of Independence. Okay? That's not what you expected me to say, I bet, but it's the case. The Declaration is a text I've done work on in other contexts. I write about it a lot. But it actually has a really basic lesson at its core, and it's this. The job of the citizenry is to diagnose whether a government is securing its rights and building a foundation to affect the safety and happiness of the whole community. Ask that question about African Americans, and the answer, my friends, is no. Okay? It's just no. But then the Declaration teaches a second lesson, which is, okay, when you do this diagnosis, what do you ask? What the Declaration asks is, what laws are hindering people's flourishing? Right? This is a different question, actually, than the one we often ask. We often want to start by asking, what services should we provide to make up for gaps? That's an important question, too. But there's another question that we have to ask, which is, what laws are hindering people's flourishing? And there is an answer to that question. And it is the laws from the war on drugs. Okay? The differential sentences for different drug uses. Drug use is an equal opportunity activity. All right? All races participate, all ethnic groups. Asian Americans use at a slightly lower level than everybody else, but otherwise, it's on par. Everybody's participating in distribution. What's the size of the drug market in this country? Anybody know that one? Every 3.5 days, Americans have spent another $1 billion on illegal drugs. $100 billion over the course of a year. Okay, that's how big the black market is that we pretend not to see. It is a massive distortion on our social world. The drug laws have created that. The sentencing laws, mandatory minimums, have created the world that we're looking at. Mass incarceration is the product of our laws. All right? We have to look at that in the first instance. Okay? The Declaration of Independence teaches you to ask this question: what laws are hindering people's flourishing? Push and pull the last 50 years as you might, these are the laws that you will come back to. All right? But I want, most importantly, to introduce you to my cousin, to Michael. Because he was so many things: beautiful, vivacious, charismatic kid, very bright, very curious, and a great writer. We thought he would tell his story himself. And so when I finally faced the fact, in answer to Skip Gates's question, that I needed to understand my cousin's story, and I finally faced that fact, I also knew that I had another job, which was to take Michael's voice, his letters, his essays, and give them a way of speaking. I had this box in my closet of his writing, and it just felt like this pulsing voice in a box, all right? And I needed to get it out. So let me just share a little bit. Michael's mom, a single mom, she had left the father of her 3 children, who was physically abusive, and she was slowly making her way forward in the world. She had lifted herself up to a nursing degree, and so she had, by this little moment in the book, gotten them out of a small apartment and into a little house in Highland Park. And I like to just share this to give you a sense of what childhood was like to start. In Highland Park, the rites of passage proceeded according to plan. Michael's beautiful kindergarten teacher, the one with the blonde afro, loved him. He graduated in high style in a white cap and gown. He had gymnastic lessons and played Little League and went to summer camp. To raise the funds for camp, he sold peanuts. so successfully even that he funded his brother and sister's trips to Camp 2. The trio would go for 3-week stints in the summer. Then they would come home, their mother would do their laundry, and then she would send them off again. They always went together. Michael also had a glorious bicycle, a He-Man bike that he loved. Their house was on top of a hill, and he would fly down it barefoot, not yet able to brake, ending up at least once with a swollen eye, with the bike all bent out of shape, and having terrified his sister, cousins, mother, anyone who was around. His sister, who was growing into a large-bodied girl and had already developed a mothering instinct, would cry out, "Michael, why don't you put no shoes on?" We visited them often at this house. Once a month from 6th to 8th grade, I would go by so Big Roz's girlfriend could relax my hair. The only slightly unusual ritual in Michael's life at the time was alitots. Since he couldn't have remembered his mother's drinking, which was done by the time he was 1, his enrollment in the program must have seemed mysterious. Karen's spirit lightens when she talks about their time in Highland Park and how amusing it was to eavesdrop on the kids' Saturday morning alitot meetings. The trio would gather outside her bedroom door, whispering up a cloud of buzzing bees. They were whispering out their grievances, which, she presumed, were mainly about her. They were a united front, and in this small house, all 4 of them had 5 years they are glad to remember. And now, a little bit more. Where were you when you were 15? Close your eyes and try to recall. I lived in a bedroom with a brass bed, with a blue and white striped Laura Ashley comforter. It was the 80s, remember? There were matching valences on my windows, and I had a wooden roll-top desk with a drawer that locked and held my secrets, including dirty letters that I couldn't at the time translate from a German boy who'd been the object of a minor summer music camp romance. I was awkward and insecure, confused about how to find my place in life. Often I was lonely. All of this was true despite the fact that I was hurtling into my junior year of high school as captain of my varsity track team. I was younger than most of my classmates at Claremont High School, and my friends all had their driver's licenses by the start of our junior year. I was not, however, allowed to ride in their cars. The only time I ever got grounded in high school was when my librarian mother caught me sneaking a ride with a friend to get to my French class at the local college. I grew up in a college town, a faculty brat, where everyone knew my mom and dad. My parents had made a critical decision early in the lives of my younger brother Mark and me that regardless of what career opportunities came my father's way, they wouldn't move until we had graduated from high school. I grew up in one place where everyone knew me. I couldn't even get away with sneaking to my college courses. Which of us does not remember what life was like at 15? The torments of adolescence leave indelible marks. 8 years after I got grounded for sneaking to class in that friend's car, my 15-year-old cousin, Michael Alexander Allen, who also didn't yet have a driver's license, was arrested for the first time for an attempted carjacking. A few months later, after he turned 16, he sat in Torrance, California, in court, the kind with the swinging gates just inside the doors of the courtroom, hands cuffed there and in an orange suit, in December 1995 and January 1996, as a judge determined that he would be charged as an adult. Now let me give you a little bit of Michael's voice from one of his essays about Dante's Inferno. He also fought fires while he was in prison, and that was very good for him. He loved it. He loved it. We hoped he would be able to do that when he got out, but the rule at the time was you had to parole to the county where you'd committed your crime, so he couldn't go to family we had in Riverside County where we hoped he could get connected to a fire camp right from the get-go. Let's see. The Inferno is constructed like a prison. It is especially similar to the Eighth Circle. The souls are in pits which are guarded by beasts and demons. They are being punished in accordance to their sins on earth. Prison is the same way. The sins we committed as citizens are judged according to law, which is based on universal principles. We who are in prison had to answer for our sins, and our lives were taken from us. Our bodies became the property of the state of California. We are reduced to numbers and stripped of our identity. To the state of California, I am not Michael Alexander Allen, but I am K10033. When they want to know anything about me, they do not type my last name in the computer, but it is my number that is inputted. My number is my name. I am K10033. And a little bit more from the end of that essay. Like Dante, I am forced to descend lower into hell to achieve a full awakening. I am forced into depression, scarred by obscenities, war after war. But each war that I survive, I am a step closer to a full awakening of self. My hell is no longer demonstrating what I am capable of doing in order to survive. It has become what I can tolerate and withstand in order to live. I cannot help but to judge those around me. I am one of them, but we are far from the same. Like Dante, I am cursed with the spirit of discernment, which allows us to see the truth for what it is. There are many whom I despise, who are truly sick beyond healing, and they should never leave this place. Then there are those who await to fulfill their destiny. I see in them a sincere and apologetic heart for their ill misdeeds. They are the ones who will change the world positively, or positively change someone's world. Hell cannot hold the latter of the two opposites, but in time will only spit them back out into society to do what is right. The hell that I live in cannot hold Dante. Hell can test and try oneself, but it cannot hold Dante, and it will not hold me. In the inferno, the dead are trapped forever. Surely, the biggest and most important difference in the inferno and my hell called prison is that I have a way out. And let me just read you the very last chapter. This little one called My Heart's Locket. In my heart's locket, 5 gangly, brown-skinned kids, cousins, will be forever at play in a pair of crepe myrtle trees, bathed in beneficent June sunshine. I love to climb trees as much as Michael. An arm here, a leg there, juts out from the tree's floral sundress, a delicate skein of pink and purple blooms. When we found unbloomed buds on the dichondra lawn, we would gently press at their nub until the skin slit and a fragile, crinkled blossom emerged whole. Meanwhile, inside the house, through the living room picture window, the adults, beloved, are forever passing their time in glancing, distracted talk. I welcome your thoughts and questions. There's a mic somewhere, I've been told. Yep, we've got a couple of mic runners in the back of the room. And don't be afraid or shy. And you can ask me about any parts of this, the story, the personal part, or the social science and history of incarceration. Despite my emotions, I am very happy to talk with all of you.
Professor Allen, thank you so much.
Please call me Danielle.
Danielle, that's Kitty. You discussed that Americans can't answer the question, what are the alternatives? And I'm sure you have thought about this a lot. We've had people come talk about restorative justice in the past, and I'm curious, for young men of color especially, who are 15, who are committing their first crime, there are clearly far better alternatives. What have you learned about the system, or what we might do to actually give you a bigger voice around this?
Well, let me just give everybody a little bit more, another piece of the historical picture to put our challenge in perspective. So We think of ancient punishment as having been quite barbaric, much more common use of execution, for instance, and that is an important part of the history of punishment over time. But there was another part of it that operated until the middle of the 19th century that we've lost track of, which is that until the middle of the 19th century, the whole world had exile as an option. Okay? Exile. That's why we have the state of Georgia. That's why we have Australia. All right? Because people were given another chance. Because people recognize that actually the percentage of people who are pathological in their violence or whatever else is very small. In fact, most violence is emerging out of networks that are problematic in the dynamics in the network, and that people can succeed if they're able to go to another place and start over. And so the world as a whole had a second chance penal system until the middle of the 19th century. The Europeans have figured out how to run a second chance penal system. We haven't. That's the fundamental difference. And so what the Europeans have figured out is restorative justice in part, so sometimes it's alternative approaches to sentencing that bring communities together, but it's also real clarity about the fact that incarceration damages people. It damages people. So in addition to using incarceration less in Europe, their sentences are so much shorter than ours, and they barely use solitary confinement. So what do they do instead? They develop a series of responses, the point of which is to help the socialization of the offender. So it's supervised work programs, halfway houses where people live under a surveillance context, but then they go out during the day to apprentice or to do work, for example. There are training programs and vocational programs also similarly structured. They do their best to maximize contact between an offender and healthy, positive social relations, including family. They do their best, to the degree that they use incarceration, to maximize the socializing value of that experience. So inmates are permitted to wear their own clothes. They are expected to and taught how to prepare their own meals, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So they use what they call a principle of association to think about punishment. And what that principle means is helping people become productive members of society requires actually doubling down on the principle of association, not cutting it off. That's the kind of core idea. And then there are a lot of different specific institutional possibilities to make that real. I should say, though, real fast, it does also matter that underneath all of that, they have a very different approach to drug control in Europe. All right? So they are building their alternative set of punishments on an alternative sentencing regime.
Hi, my name is Ellen Alberding. I'm from Chicago. And in Chicago, we have, as you know, a real problem with gun crime,
Yep.
homicides and shootings. And the predominant circumstances are that it's happening on the South and West Side, and it's mostly young African-American men. There's a tension between the political need and desire to have enhanced sentencing for gun crimes, and on the other side, wanting to not excessively punish young men who are often carrying guns because they need them for self-defense, or they perceive it that way. And I wonder if you could talk about the tension that lies between those 2 points of view, even often in the same person, whether it's our mayor or other elected officials. They have that internal conflict, and I think our whole city has that internal conflict.
Absolutely. And that tension, I would say, arises from the effort to treat the symptom, not the cause. Let me explain, all right? So this is going to take a little bit more of digging into the history of drug markets and gangs. So it's a $100 billion market, folks, the drug market, all right? It is a market that does not operate with the advantage of legally enforceable contracts, right? If you have a market of that scale and you can't rely on legally enforceable contracts to operate it, you rely on violence. If you have a market of that scale, you will have a high level of violence, period. There's just no choice. Like, those things go together, all right? So, okay, why does the violence have the shape it has? Think back to the early 1980s, when the federal and state governments decided to tackle drug markets by targeting low-level street distributors, all right? Taking out the sort of street sales of drugs. Yes, they also were spraying crops in Central and South America and doing some targeting of higher-level traffickers, but a whole lot of the effort was about targeting low-level street distribution. Okay, now, put yourself in the mind of a person at the top of that market chain, okay? And you're running a business that can do $100 billion of volume a year, and somebody's trying to take away your distributors. Are you going to let them go? You are not. You are not. So whatever deterrent strategies the state starts trying to use to keep people from participating in distribution, you are going to develop harder ones, tougher ones. And the violence gets woven into the whole structure of the drug economy as a way of keeping the distributive channels intact. Okay, what happens to kids living in a world where the state is fighting what I call the parastate? Because that's what we've had in the world of the drug market for the last 30 years. State fighting parastate. And then you've got kids, 9, 10, 11, 12, in the mix. When you dig into the sociological literature on gang involvement, and that is what happened to Michael, is that that week of violence was crystallizing a gang relationship that none of us had seen. None of the adults in his life had seen, all right? That's what happened. And when you dig into the literature, what you find over and over again is the following story. Kids find themselves in a world of violence. They need protection, to the point, you made that point in your question. They need protection in that world of violence. Who makes the first offer of protection? Gangs, all right? Not the state. The state's not helping protect those kids, okay? And then once you accept a little protection, you're stuck. And the cycle repeats itself over and over again. So I would say, for my, it's hard for me to answer your question about this tension between tougher sentences on guns, but recognizing young people's need for protection, because I feel like that's just treating the symptom. The cause is the underlying illegal drug economy that's $100 billion in its scale. There are alternatives. Again, Portugal has pursued an alternative. The alternative is you recognize that addiction is a health problem, not a criminal justice problem, and you transition the whole structure for dealing with drug control from a criminal justice model to a health model. What does that actually mean? Legalized marijuana. Okay, I know Colorado's comfortable with that already, so good job, people. All right, decriminalize harder drugs. What does that mean? Doesn't mean legalize, but it means have simple use and possession be a misdemeanor, not a felony. You redirect your criminal justice resources to the highest level traffickers, and you build up health services for addiction treatment. In Portugal, this has resulted in lower adolescent drug use, increased quantities of contraband captured, and more people seeking health treatment for addiction. Okay? Portugal is small. It's a very different country from our country. It's just one case where the model has been tried comprehensively. Other countries around the world are interested in this model. They sought at a UN meeting a couple of years ago to put this paradigm forward and achieve UN endorsement for it. That is being blocked by the Office of, I can't remember the exact name, the UN Office of Crime Control and things like that. It's the Crime Control Office of the UN, where the leadership position in that office is currently held by Russia. And the people who are committed to the war on drugs model that we have used for the last 30 years are Russia, Iran, the United States, okay? Central and South America is ready for the Portugal model. There's just so much to say in this space, but again, I come back to there's an underlying cause here. Of course, we're getting confused about the symptom, because if you just treat the symptom, yes, you're always in this back and forth about why it doesn't work and how you balance out the different parts and things like that. But we really have to tackle the cause.
First, I just want to thank you for sharing your heart with us, because that's uncommon in this setting, and it's really special. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
I'm really struck by the different experience of you and your sibling, and Michael and his siblings. And I'm guessing, and I don't know, but I'm guessing that must be part of this story, that something that happened when he was very small, or maybe a series of things, stayed with him and scarred him in a way that led to what was to come. That's dear to my heart and close to my area of interest, and I just wonder if that's correct or if I'm way off base.
It's a slightly different story. I mean, you're asking the right questions. So I can tell you what happened, but it took so when I decided to make this the topic of my lectures, first I asked my aunt for permission to do this. And then I sat down with family members and did a lot of interviews. My aunt had gotten rid of Michael's legal papers, so I had to file a Freedom of Information Act equivalent request at the state level to get his legal papers. It was actually a very hard job to reconstruct the basic picture. And we had never done that. We had never talked together, so we had not actually understood what had happened. But the short of it is that when Michael was about 9, Karen met and married a man who turned out to be physically abusive. And again, this is another example of how shame blocks us from seeing and addressing the truth. What happened was, so between the period of Karen's marriage and when Michael was arrested, the family moved about 5 times, and he had sort of 5 mid-year school transitions. And this was partly from this gentleman, and then also as Karen was trying to get away from this situation, she was trying to get out of it. And it was that critical adolescent moment, right? Adolescence is hard for everybody. That sort of period from 9, 10 to 13, 14 is really, really critical in youth development. And in this period, again, Michael had 5 mid-year school transitions. He landed in South Central after the apartment building they lived in Claremont, our town, had burnt down. His mother wanted to get closer to her job, so she moved them back to Los Angeles. And he landed in South Central as a sort of disconnected young person. South Central was already a place very riven by gang affiliations. And the short of it is, if you come into that place and you don't have connections already, you have to prove yourself. You have to show where you stand. If you grow up in that space, there's a certain way in which you kind of skirt around the margins because people sort of know what neighborhood you're from and you don't have to prove yourself. But Michael was a disconnected young person. At any rate, so the point of all of that is just that there was this sort of period of great change in his youth. But the other thing I was trying to say here is that the fact that Karen was physically abused is something that I learned working on this book. Even my father, who to this day they speak every week and could see that something was not right, they were moving, that there was trouble and was trying to help, didn't know until I was working on this book. And so shame suppresses our ability to talk about the things that are troubles in people's life across the board. And unless we can get through that, destigmatize the problem of domestic violence, destigmatize what it means to have incarcerated loved ones and things like that, we can't honestly address the struggles that people have. So thank you for your question.
Hi, Danielle. Sean Mickens. The question I have actually goes back to the conversation you were talking about alternatives just a moment ago. And even in thinking about the Portugal example, the question I was more curious about is if you've done any thoughts or any additional research around the economics that are involved. And 2 things that generally come to mind to me are civil asset forfeitures, as well as if you start the legalization of marijuana and you start decriminalizing some of the drugs, the opportunities within taxation and what that would actually mean, and like how does the state and the para-state structure kind of play off each other within regards to those 2?
Thank you. Those are great questions. I think there's a lot of work to be done in this space to understand the answers to all of those questions. I want to be very clear about 2 things. So To suggest that we should broadly legalize and broadly decriminalize is not to say, oh, yippee, it's party time. No, to the contrary, it's about an alternative approach to drug control. Drugs do bad things to people. That's just, it's the case. Even marijuana, right, is connected to schizophrenia in young people, and we have to be honest about that. So I want to just be very clear that it's still a kind of drug control paradigm, but it's a sort of health-based one. And then the second important thing to say is it's not a silver bullet either, and this is to your point. So for example, one of the things people don't know about how illegal or organized crime works is that some of the cartels, Mexican cartels that have been involved in the drug trade for the last 20 years, prior to NAFTA, were actually spending most of their energy getting flat screen televisions from the US into Mexico. Okay? The point is, there's product substitution. If you have the capacity to deliver illegal products, you'll have product substitution if you take away the product that people are working with. So at this point, the world has a big network of organized crime that's not just doing drugs, it's doing human trafficking, it's doing weapons and so forth. And so to get rid of a chunk of that in this country doesn't ultimately address that problem. You still need to deal with organized crime. But it also then means that in the domestic context, yes, you need to have a functioning, legal, bright light, back in the world of light, market economy that can provide opportunities and jobs and bring people into that space, train people up as entrepreneurs and so forth, rather than seeing them continue with the kind of habits and practices that have come with an illegal culture, if that makes any sense. So I'm sorry, that was not a very good succinct answer, but the point I'm trying to make is simply that, yes, economic opportunity is a big part of the story. Thinking about a legal drug market requires also thinking about the economic questions you're asking about taxation, how the market gets licensed and so forth. John Boehner, people may have seen, has recently joined the board of a marijuana producing company, right? So folks are changing horses quickly as economic opportunities come into view. And there needs to be equity and fairness as we watch the development of a legal market. I think we have time for one last question.
You haven't explicitly addressed institutional racism, and I was thinking about that in the context of what happened to Michael. Ta-Nehisi Coates talks about how he went through this very long ritual in the morning just to make sure he was wearing something or not wearing something that would get him killed on the way to school.
Right.
I know you can do all these great things with the drug laws and everything else, but if you're not protected in your community, right? If you can't even get to school safely, and that's predominantly in poor, of color neighborhoods, then it's not going to work out ultimately anyway. How do you address the institutional racism that causes the difference in sentencing laws and the difference in protection in neighborhoods and the difference in how the police treat people?
So I have many pieces of my answer to your question, which is a very important one, so thank you. So the first is that if one designs a fair and equitable sentencing system of drug laws and so forth, they must also be fairly enforced and not disparately enforced. So our problems have been not just the laws we have, but also their disparate enforcement. Absolutely. Those things go together. But I don't want the fact of disparate enforcement to distract us from the fact that the underlying problem is what the thing there to enforce was in the first place. Okay? So my goal is let's build a fair and decent legal system, and then yes, let's also enforce that fairly and equally across the board without disparities. And people should be aware that when you build a problematic legal system, even if you have racism, that means it applies worst, hardest, fastest to one set of people, eventually it applies to everybody. So the demographic group that has seen the greatest increase in incarceration in the last decade is white women, because of the opioid crisis. Okay? So it's like you build a structure like this, it will catch everyone. Okay? We really have to look at what we've built And so for me, again, the basis is let's get back to the fair and decent structure for everybody, and then also, yes, let's enforce that fairly and decently and without disparities. Thank you.